You do not survive Chosin by being lucky. You survive because you refuse to die, because some stubborn part of you decides that frostbite, bullets, hunger, exhaustion, fear, and the collapse of an entire front will not be the end of you. That was a rule the Marines lived by, even if the world thought otherwise. For months leading to the winter of 1950, Chinese and North Korean commanders laughed at the very idea that the Frozen Division, as they mockingly called the 1st Marine Division, could hold in the mountains of North Korea. They believed no American force could endure the cold, the altitude, the endless white. They believed the Marines, cut off, tired, stretched thin, would break like brittle ice. That was the truth everyone in the enemy command accepted. But in November that year, at 30 degrees below zero, when the world turned white and hostile armies poured down from the ridgelines, one man and his squad would discover how far a Marine could be pushed before something terrifying awakened inside him, and how a so-called frozen division shattered the expectations of two armies. Frank Harrigan was 30, red-haired, square-jawed, a former steel mill worker from Pittsburgh who had fought in Okinawa and hoped he would never see another war. His wife had begged him not to re-enlist, but after the Korean conflict erupted, he felt a sense of duty he couldn't explain. He joined the 1st Marine Division and deployed into a country he had never heard of, into terrain no one understood, into a campaign that would become a legend whispered with equal parts dread and reverence. When Harrigan arrived near the Chosin Reservoir with his squad, he felt the cold before he saw the enemy. It wasn't normal cold. It was a cold that carved its way into bone, that froze sweat into needles, that stiffened boots until they felt like stone. Rifle oil congealed. Canteens froze solid. Marines urinated to thaw machine guns. You couldn't even touch metal without tearing skin. And yet, day after day, the order came: advance north, push toward the Yalu. General MacArthur promised no major Chinese force was in Korea. Intelligence insisted China would never intervene in scale. And so the Marines moved forward, climbing ridgelines, crossing icy rivers, trudging through drifts that swallowed ankles, then calves, then knees. Harrigan could feel something wrong in the air, something too quiet, too still. By late November, Chinese forces, numbering more than 100,000, slipped undetected into the mountains around them. And as the Marines stretched thinner and thinner, the noose tightened invisibly. Every night, strange echoes rolled across the peaks. Footsteps, maybe. Whispers. The click of rocks. Harrigan's men asked if he heard it too. He pretended he didn't. The truth was worse than fear. The truth was that they were being surrounded. On the night of November 27th, the world ended in sound. The Chinese struck in waves, human waves, blowing bugles that pierced the darkness. Thousands poured from the ridges like an avalanche of bodies. They moved fast, screaming, firing burp guns, hurling grenades. Harrigan slammed his squad behind a snowbank as gunfire tore the night apart. The line buckled, bent, nearly broke. Marines fired until their fingers bled, until their gloves froze to their rifles, until their barrels glowed red. Bullets snapped overhead. Mortar blasts shook the earth. The Chinese kept coming. Harrigan shouted orders he could barely hear himself speak. His radio man, barely 19, took a round to the shoulder and collapsed. Corporal Ruiz dragged him behind a truck, while Harrigan laid down suppressive fire. At one point, the Chinese were so close Harrigan could see frost caked in their eyebrows. He fired, reloaded, fired again, his breath a cloud of ice. The temperature plunged to minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit. Wounded Marines froze to death, if not carried inside. Blood turned black on the snow. But somehow, by dawn, the line held, shattered, bleeding, exhausted, but held. And when the sun rose, the size of the enemy became horrifyingly clear. Harrigan saw bodies, hundreds, scattered across the hills. It wasn't a victory. It was a warning. The Chinese had committed entire divisions, and the Marines were alone, their supply lines severed, their exit routes captured, their ammunition dwindling, and the Chinese believed they had them trapped forever. What they didn't know was that no Marine trapped at Chosin ever accepted the word trapped. The order came down, we're not retreating, we're attacking in another direction. Harrigan laughed when he first heard it, not because it was funny, but because it was insane, and because it was the only option that made sense. So the march began, 80 miles to the sea, surrounded the entire way. Every ridge, every valley, every curve in the road a choke point. Chinese snipers watched from tree leans. Mines lay hidden beneath snow. Convoys froze to the road. Trucks backfired in the cold and drew fire. Frostbite gnawed at fingers and toes. Ammunition froze to belts. But the Marines moved, slowly, methodically, relentlessly. Harrigan marched at the head of the squad, rifle slung, jaw clenched. At one point, a blizzard hit with winds so fierce men had to link arms to stay upright. Harrigan remembers Ruiz shouting over the wind, "We're walking through hell." Harrigan shouted back, "Hell's warmer." They pushed on. At Toktong Pass, the narrow lifeline controlling their route south, Fox Company held against thousands of Chinese attackers. Harrigan's unit fought to reach them. Every step felt like dragging a mountain. At 1,500 yards from the ridgeline, Chinese machine guns opened fire. The Marines hit the snow. Bullets cracked over their heads. Harrigan crawled, snow filling his sleeves, ice stinging his cheeks, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure the enemy could hear it. They advanced by inches, by feet, by yards, each one earned in blood and sweat. Mortars rained down. Screams cut the wind. At 900 yards, the Chinese charged downhill. Harrigan rose to one knee, firing controlled bursts. He saw silhouettes emerging to the white veil of snow, their shapes flickering like ghosts. At 600 yards, the Marines countercharged, shouting, stumbling, slipping, fighting with bayonets, fists, rifle stocks. Harrigan felt someone collide with him, a Chinese soldier, both tumbling into the snow. They grappled desperately. Harrigan's glove tore. His bare hand slapped against icy steel. Pain seared his skin. He wrenched free, grabbed his K-bar, and ended the struggle with single thrust. When Fox Company was finally relieved, many of its survivors wept. Not because they were weak, but because they had been strong for too long. Harrigan helped carry the wounded down the slope, their bodies stiff with cold, their breaths shallow. Some murmured deliriously about home. Some didn't speak at all. The convoy reformed. The march continued. If you find this kind of forgotten military history as riveting as we do, we'd be honored if you subscribed. These stories deserve to be remembered, and your support brings them to life for new generations. As they pushed south, the Chinese continued their assault, but something had changed. The Marines, half frozen and half dead, fought with a precision and fury the enemy had never expected. Harrigan's squad formed rear guards, ambush screens, and fire teams that moved like clockwork. Every attack was repelled with brutal efficiency. The Chinese commanders who mocked the frozen division as weak and miserable now realized these men were something else entirely. Soldiers who would not die, would not surrender, and would not stop moving until they reached the sea. Harrigan saw in their eyes when they captured a young Chinese soldier. Shock, disbelief, fear. "You were supposed to run," the prisoner whispered. "You were supposed to freeze." But the Marines didn't freeze. They adapted. They overcame. They fought on. At one point, the convoy crossed a blown-out bridge, replaced by a makeshift engineering genius. Marines directed traffic, while mortars exploded around them. Vehicles skidded. Men cursed. Harrigan slipped on ice, slammed his knee, stood up, kept going. By the time they reached Hagaru-ri, the division was a ghost of itself. Frostbitten, wounded, starving, but unbreakable. And when they finally reached the coast of Hungnam, breaking through encirclement after 14 days of relentless combat, evacuation ships waited with hulls large enough to carry entire regiments. Harrigan looked back at the mountains they had escaped, jagged, white, and silent, and realized he had lived through something no one would believe unless they had been there. He had seen men frozen upright in firing positions. He He had watched friends lose fingers, toes, and sometimes hope. He had held dying Marines in his arms while whispering promises neither of them believed. He had fought in temperatures that turned blood to crystals and breath to smoke. And yet, he had survived. They all had, because they never stopped moving, never stopped fighting, never accepted defeat. Years later, Harrigan would return home, marry his wife, raise children, work at the mill again. He rarely spoke of Chosin. When he did, it was only to say, "We weren't heroes, we were Marines. That's what Marines do." But history would remember differently. To this day, the breakout from the Chosin Reservoir stands as one of the greatest fighting withdrawals in military history, a triumph of discipline, grit, and brotherhood against impossible odds. And the men who fought there, the so-called Frozen Division, prove to the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be controlled by it. If this story moved you, please hit the like button. Every click tells the algorithm this history is worth remembering. We're dedicated to rescuing the forgotten stories from the archives. And if you want to join us, subscribe and turn on notifications. Where are you watching from? Drop a comment with your city or state, and tell us if someone in your family served. And thank you for ensuring that Frank, Red, Harrigan, and the men of the 1st Marine Division do not disappear into silence. They deserve to be remembered.